All right, so this is the first of our Global Antitrust Institute author interview series as part of our upcoming release to our report on the digital economy, which is the Global Antitrust Institute's report covering all things in the digital economy. It's going to serve as a primer on key economic concepts, and it's going to analyze the state of competition, digital economy, and evaluate some of the proposals put together by different governmental bodies, think tanks, and regulators on how to best regulate the digital economy. My guest today is John Yoon, who is an associate professor of law at Antonin Scalia Law School at George Mason. He is the director of economic education at the Global Antitrust Institute and a longtime economist at the Federal Trade Commission. John is our biggest author for this report, taking on, I think, 4 total chapters covering all sorts of stuff from vertical integration to big data to network effects, doing all of the work. So John, we're excited to have you here today. And if you wouldn't mind talking about the chapters we're going to cover today, which are going to be network effects and platforms and big data.
Thank you, Matt. Appreciate it. And yeah, happy to do a quick overview. So yeah, one of the first chapters in the report, if not the first one, is on network effects and platforms. And so this is really just a primer. And the idea is to set the stage. And while, for those of us who live and breathe antitrust, these concepts come across our desk almost daily. And so we're very used to it. For those even who are very interested in antitrust, but are not as deeply involved, these concepts might not be as obvious. So I walk through the idea of network effects, multi-sided platforms, different types of network effects, different types of platforms. And so I really walk through that exercise. And one of the things that I find particularly interesting is platforms are obviously not completely homogeneous. They're very different and very different types. And so David Evans has come up with a classification scheme. Phil Strucy and co-authors have as well, and that's what the Supreme Court cited in Ohio versus American Express. And so what I've done is I've read through them, and what I've tried to do is kind of meld both of them together into maybe a unified system, at least give it an attempt. And also recognizing there's some complexities with a lot of these issues. Just take, for example, Amazon. Mm-hmm. Amazon is very much like Walmart in a lot of ways, a very traditional single-sided retailer. Think of its Kindle product or its Alexa products. It private labels those, manufactures them, effectively inventories them, and sells it directly to the consumer. And it does that for a lot of its products. But there's also the Amazon marketplace, which is increasingly becoming a big part of Amazon's business. I believe when they started in the late 90s, it was less than 3%, this marketplace. And the marketplace is where they allow third-party sellers to match up with buyers. And so Amazon is more the middleman in that case. And so as it's becoming an increasingly important part of their business, it's almost starting to define what Amazon is and some of the associated issues. Consequently, Amazon isn't just one big either single-sided market or multi-sided market. It's a mix of the both. And, and it's also could be a mix of the different types of multi-sided platforms. So that's what the chapter's about, is really a walkthrough of that exercise.
Yeah. So I think it might make sense then to kind of cover the first part of that exercise, which is network effects, which are something that is closely associated with these types of platforms, but kind of separate from the idea of a platform. So are there different types of network effects, and how do those work if there are?
Yeah, I think we can make two broad sort of categories for network effects. The first is what I think we would traditionally think of as a network effect. These are the direct network effects. And I'll go to the classic example of a telephone. In order to make a phone call, the other person needs a phone number and some device to receive and transmit voice. And you need that as well. And once you have that, you've matched and you're on the same system and network, and you derive a value from that. As others get telephone numbers and devices and join the networks, then your total value for being on the network continues to increase, maybe at a diminishing rate, but it increases. And so we're obviously used to the telephone network, the email system that we enjoy, fax machines, which is fading, but still holding on in certain segments of the economy. All these enjoy these direct network effects, whereas more users join, the existing users benefit and create a more vibrant product. The indirect network effect directly apply to platforms. And this is when you have 2 or more groups participating. And so we can go back to this idea of Amazon, where you have the third-party sellers and the users or buyers who are interested in those products. And so what the indirect network effect is that as one group participates more, it affects the welfare of another group. And so as more sellers are on that platform, that creates more attraction to buyers on that platform. Mm-hmm. And it goes both ways. As there's more buyers on the Amazon platform, that attracts more third-party sellers to the platform. Now, it doesn't have to be symmetrical. You can think of an advertising platform such as Google Search, where it's the advertisers who are really attracted when there's a lot of users, but it doesn't necessarily go as strongly, at least the other way, where there's a lot of advertisers. That doesn't really start to drive demand for Google Search. It's more the content and the algorithm. So those are the two main network effects that I walked through. And so, yeah.
Got it. Yeah. The indirect ones definitely seem to be the big ticket item right now.
Yes, right now that's the big one.
So next, I guess, is what makes a platform a unique business model? Because you hear about it a lot now with Facebook, Google, Amazon. These are the big platform companies, but platforms aren't necessarily a new business model, but might be the most prominent at this point.
Yeah, I don't even know if they were actually village matchmakers, but assuming the lore is true, it goes back as far back as the village matchmaker, which is trying to bring young people together for courtship and potential marriage, and two separate groups coming together and as a matchmaker. And that's really the essence of the idea. In anticipation of today's conversation, I actually looked up when the first newspaper advertisement was here in the US, and it was, or in America, it was May 8th, 1704 in the Boston Newsletter. And it was the sale of real estate on Oyster Bay in Long Island. And so there it is. It goes back to 1704 in terms of the business. So obviously the business model isn't anything new, or certainly the practice of bringing together two or more groups isn't anything new. But clearly with the digital age and the different technologies and the internet, that there's a greater market with all this information. We think, oh, there's more available to people, but I think it makes it increasingly difficult to match people to some degree because of so much information. And so there's a role for matchmakers to provide all that sort of content that's out there that's desirable, and aggregate it and compress it and curate it in a form that users find valuable. And that will create this vibrant network. And so consequently, I think it's the digital infrastructure that's created this demand, but clearly it's been around for a very long time.
Yeah, definitely. And as far as the digital infrastructure and seeing it with the network effects and platforms coming up, and those seemingly being the big issues on the antitrust agenda moving forward, how should practitioners and economists think about platforms and network effects and antitrust enforcement?
So that's the big question, right? And this chapter can't address that question. There's certainly a body of work out there that addresses it, and we're still working on it. So my premise, Matt, is I always like to start with conduct. I find that antitrust is not easy, but is the most approachable when we think of it as trying to understand conduct. Not whether it's good or bad at first, but to understand what's happening. And then we can make an assessment whether that's in violation of the antitrust laws. So when we do that, the business model may or may not be important to that exercise. Certain types of conduct, let's say an exclusive deal or collusion, knowing how the firm is organizing itself might not give us the insights that we really need. And so, in fact, the platform material could be a distraction from the larger investigation. But in other areas where a platform is engaging in certain behavior to effectively balance the interest of various groups, you can think of Uber as balancing the interest of passengers and drivers. And in some ways, they share incentives, but in other ways, their incentives are in conflict. And so Uber at times favors one group or the other with their various practices. And so focusing solely on one side or sort of segmenting them into sort of two separate single-sided markets, it can be done. One has to be careful. I just think it's more natural to view them in those types of conduct cases as a more unified where they're balancing both. And but the ultimate goal, like if you look at taxi cab companies are organized very differently. And so how you analyze their incentives are going to be different depending on the conduct. So I think it depends. And the answer is that it matters in certain instances and it doesn't in other instances. And so that's what we need to be aware of. I don't think we need completely new tools to address platforms, but we have to address our tools to the reality of these different types of conduct.
Got it. Yeah. So then kind of the next chapter we're going to talk about is somewhat related to the network effects portion of the platform chapters, but also just a little bit maybe to the side of it, and that is the role of big data and antitrust. So I'm wondering if you can give us an overview of kind of what you're trying to do there.
Yeah, so big data is a big topic, obviously, in antitrust. Well, I'm not sure everyone wants to talk about big data. There's a little big data fatigue, perhaps, but it's certainly still out there. And so what the chapter is trying to do is break up the discussion into various segments. And so the first thing I do is really look at big data from a larger framework of production function and where does it fit in. And this isn't an empirical study, so I'm not trying to answer the question, but really to create a framework of how we should consider big data. There are times when big data is largely the reason for a platform or a market's success, and that's certainly true. But there are other times the presence of big data isn't the reason for a platform success. It certainly is a contributor and be complementary to other inputs, but isn't really the sole driver or the primary driver. And so we just have to have an openness to that, to these various possibilities and hypotheses. I think we get in trouble when we have a set view that big data is all the time important or big data is never important, right? I think somewhere in between. If you think of something more recent like Slack as a platform or TikTok, clearly these are growing and important platforms and ways people communicate with each other, but their data, big data, is largely internal, and that their value proposition was already there before the big data. And then as users joined and the platform got thicker, they collected data and they can improve and innovate. So it's not that data is not unimportant, but I think it would, I don't know for sure, but it would surprise me to learn that big data was required before they could enter with these products. I think certainly innovation, R&D, and patents, all those are important. So that's not to diminish the effort to bring these products, but I'm not sure big data itself was. And so we've seen the success of them. And so big data is a part of it, but where does it fit into the larger question? So another part I look at is in terms of how we consider it in terms of barriers to entry, and how we define that. Barriers to entry is a very vast and large subject, and economists define it in very different ways, and practitioners use it in various different ways. And I was looking at how courts use it in different ways, and it's just kind of a mess because people mean different things when we talk about barriers to entry. So does big data fit into it? Well, we have to really address the larger question of what is a barrier to entry in the first place. And so I go a little bit into that. I certainly don't devote too much time to that, but that's also a big part of the discussion as well. So those are the main things that I try to accomplish in the chapter.
Yeah. So I guess building off of the barriers to entry a little bit, I mean, you mentioned we have Slack that's come in and TikTok, and then the platform we're using right now, Zoom, that has kind of pumped up during the COVID-19 time, all coming in theoretically without the big data advantages of some incumbents that might, you think, enter these markets. So I guess, is big data a traditional barrier to entry, and how should we think about it in terms of these types of markets?
Yeah, I think it can be. Now, the definition that I like about barriers to entry is a hindrance that doesn't allow an entrant to come in and where that entry would be socially beneficial. So if you take something like economies of scale, which in certain definitions would be a barriers to entry, and economies of scale is where your average cost of production falls as you produce more and more, and effectively you're spreading your huge fixed and sunk costs over more and more output. Is that a barrier to entry? Some would say yes, but others might say no, because that barrier, it's not clear that entry would be beneficial in that case, in that the firm enjoying the economies of scale is producing at a relatively low cost. Now, if there's a lot of market power associated with it, then obviously an associated entry would be beneficial to that. So it's not entirely clear based on the premise in of itself. We have to look at the ultimate welfare effect of that. So the same applies to big data. Is it a barrier to entry? I think for us, in terms of our everyday work in antitrust, I think a good question would be not whether it's 0-1, whether it's a barrier to entry or not, because then it's like, okay, now what? Where does that get us into some legal category or presumptions? And I don't think it does. And so a lot of effort on something that doesn't really buy us much. And I think what's more important is to consider it like we consider other entry conditions in terms of the timeliness, likelihood, and sufficiency of entry and how it affects that. And so is it a hindrance to entry? Yes, but there's a lot of hindrances to entry. And I think things such as innovation, R&D expenditures, patents, all those we consider largely virtuous in that, but they obviously create barriers and hindrances to entry. And so in a similar way, big data can do the same thing. It can improve a product and be innovative, but it can also make it more difficult for an entrant in certain markets to come in. And so both of those can be true at the same time.
Now, I think a similar point, kind of building off of this and then tying it back to the network effects discussion, is the idea that the possession of big data in a market with network effects, or just network effects on their own when you have a large amount of users, create tipping and lock-in and winner take all or winner take most markets. So do you think that necessarily the possession of these and then the presence of network effects causes that, or?
Yeah, that's actually a very central and important question right now. And there's certainly a lot of talk that when you have data, big data, it creates effectively, as you mentioned, a data network effect, a data-driven network effect. And just to summarize quickly, and there are more nuances to it, but the idea is that as you have more users, you collect more data on them, which then allows you to improve your product, which then allows you to collect more users or attract more users, which then you collect more data, and it's, rinse and repeat this entire process. And so effectively, if you're a first mover, even if you didn't need a lot of big data to enter, it creates this snowball effect that makes it more and more difficult for entrants to come in and compete with your incumbency. And so there's an intuitive appeal to that process, and it's not to reject that process happens, but let's break down that process a little bit. I mean, number one, it's premised on improvements in quality. Part of that cycle is that you get the data and it improves the quality, and that improves the user experience, and it brings in more users. That's a good thing, right? And so I would view it similar to innovation and investment, as well as R&D and patent investments and copyright, right? You're improving your portfolio for the benefit of the users, hopefully, and that makes some sense in terms of a better welfare outcome. So that's observation number one. And so number two is it just doesn't just happen, right? When you get more data, unlike network effects like a telephone, people join the network or they don't. Now, it's not to say there's no cost with more people joining, but it's largely marginal. More people join and it's great, or more people join get an email, and that really helps the network. Here, you're getting more data, but you can't just suddenly stick it in a black box and the quality is improved, right? It takes effort, it takes innovation from that data to improve and create a better product. And so I think it's Hal Varian, I think, who calls it more of a data opportunity rather than a data network effect. And that I think that makes a lot of sense in terms of this characterization. It's a data opportunity. So it certainly can have that effect, but it takes resources, and we usually think those are good things for the market. And going back to the point that I made earlier is, what's the importance of data? Certain markets, data are really important, and so this effect would be more relevant for that potentially. But for other markets, data isn't as important, even if it's part of the production process. And so this data-driven effect wouldn't really necessarily explain sort of success or failure in the various platforms.
Yes, and I think a good example of that, which you bring up in your chapter, is kind of Google Plus, where you have all of these people on the platform that you have theoretically a bunch of data by having Google search, Gmail, and having these users seated, but then seeing that when it opens up and they have these advantages that you'd think don't necessarily lead to like the market leading social media network there for Google. So, hey
man, speak for yourself. I'm still on the Plus. No, it's gone, right? It's gone. I don't even if I wanted to be on the Plus, it's gone. No, that's a class. I think first time I saw that example with Catherine Tucker, and she really highlighted, and I think it's a great example.
Yeah.
I think Pinar Aikman also made use of that. And those are terrific, because what happened is they seeded something like 50 million users from just Gmail. And so they had already a huge network. They have big data with Google having, and Facebook, and certainly all these large companies have plenty of data to improve and to tailor their products. And it was a huge failure. And so that shows clearly. Now, that doesn't mean, one case example disproves the point, but I think it should raise some caution, and especially the experiences of other platforms. Browsers, has certainly gone through a lot of iterations of market leaders, Internet Explorer to Firefox to Chrome, and no one collects more data than browsers. I mean, they collect pretty much every click where they could, and so to see disruption there, music. Same thing with how we consume digital music. Certainly iTunes was a market leader early on, and then Spotify and streaming. And now Apple's playing, now they're catching up with their Apple Music, and they discontinued iTunes. But so this shows you how these markets are quite dynamic. And I don't think we have that lock-in that maybe we saw with an earlier era of telephones and fax machines and even email to some degree, and the QWERTY keyboard. And various things like that, which an important point is, even if we have a lock-in, that doesn't necessarily mean it's inefficient or we've locked into the wrong standard. Leibowitz and Margolis have done a ton of good work in that area. So yeah, these are great issues that we all contemplate, but I don't think tip-in is as a big concern in these markets, which isn't to say there's no market power there. Because there's plenty of multi-homing. I think the transaction cost to switch from one network or another is clearly different today than it was previously, and so all those factors are relevant.
Yeah, I agree. That makes a lot of sense, especially when you see all these new things coming up that supplant the old thing, and then another new one comes along to pass that on. It's just constantly switching. True. So I don't want to keep you too much longer, so I think we can end on a couple questions related to this. So outside of reading your chapters in the report this fall, is there any other must-read articles or books on these topics that you'd recommend?
Yeah, whenever I have a recommendation list, I'm tempted to go back to the two books that I think are really good for this particular information, which is Shapiro and Varian have information rules. I think it was from even 1999 or something like that. It's a great book that still is very relevant today on a lot of these issues that we still face in terms of network effects and platforms. And Leibowitz and Margolis also collected a lot of their writings in Winners, Losers, and Microsoft that came out roughly around that same time. So yeah, these are a bit dated. If you look, the late 90s, I mean, come on, welcome to 2020. Well, I'm not sure we want to be welcome to 2020. It's been, let's not, but certainly I think those are still classics that I would, but in terms of looking forward, Baker's book, which he just released, I'm looking forward to going through that. Anything Jonathan Baker writes, I think we should all listen carefully to what he has, because he's very thoughtful. And Greg Worden has a new book out, something like Foundations of Antitrust, of that nature, and has a cool picture of Sherman on the cover. And for that reason alone, I want to know. But Greg obviously just recently retired, but I'm always interested in hearing what he has to say. So those are the set of books I think certainly on my list of things to reread or to read.
Yep, a fellow report author there too.
Oh yeah, right.
Yep. And then one last kind of more fun question. Not everything's fun in here, and it's all interesting, but not directly antitrust related. Is what non-antitrust book that you've read recently would you recommend?
Oh, so I'm reading The Tempest by Shakespeare.
Oh.
And I have to say it's as inaccessible as I remember. And, I used to think Shakespeare was pretty good, and maybe it's just The Tempest, but it is good, but it's more, I'm just getting older. I don't know. It's more inaccessible, but it's very rewarding for the effort that I'm putting in, I find. So I certainly would recommend The Tempest.
Perfect. Well, with that, thank you for joining us today. We look forward to reading your chapter when the report comes out in a couple weeks.
Thanks so much. Appreciate it.